Hey, what's up everybody? In this video, we're going to really dive into the timeline, switches, and modes. Our goal is when we're creating complex After Effects projects or motion design projects, our timeline can get pretty busy, and it can also start to get really hard to figure out what layers are where. Today, I'm going to start with a composition that has multiple layer types, and we're going to go over things like switches and modes as well as pre-composition to give you an idea on how you can clean up and organize your timeline. The thing with the timeline is it actually contains more controls that can fit on the screen at once. We learned this in a previous lesson when we had to toggle on the switch at the bottom to expand and collapse the transfer control pane. This little button is going to open up all of the different switches and modes that you have access to. The reason that's there is some of us are working on smaller laptops, and you may want to save some screen real estate. By clicking this little button, that's going to help you save that real estate. You can see the modes that we previously discussed. Each layer is going to have a specific type of blending mode. There's different track mats. We'll discuss that in later videos, as well as different parenting links, which we'll also discuss in a later video. Today, we're really focusing on this section. These are known as your switches. Switches control features like things like visibility, audio, soloing, locking, shy layers, motion blur, adjustment layers, and even some 3D behavior. They're different than our modes, which are our blending modes, our track mats, and so forth. We can toggle these on and off pretty easily. You can also use your function F4 key to completely hide or show those. If you're using function F4, that's going to kind of show those or hide those. The first thing we want to kind of talk about, which we've talked about before, is a good timeline organization begins with really clear layer names. Remember, in previous lessons, we've learned that your asset name does not necessarily have to match your layer name. For instance, I have this great kind of popsicle ad here, and you can see at the top I have this dripping chocolate. While it's currently showing my layer name as the actual file name, I'm going to hit enter on that, and I'm going to say drip at top. Sometimes making it more direct in the layer stack is going to help you find that file quicker. Another thing to kind of think about, which we've talked about before, is the different layer colors. Every layer color by default will come in most likely like one of these kind of purple shades. And that's going to not only define the actual layer length in and out points within your timeline itself, but it's going to give you a color for the transform box that's placed on top of that asset. What I typically like to do, and there's no science to this, do what makes you works for you, is I like to go through and I like to kind of change the different types of assets with different colors. So if I know I have specific text, maybe I'll just make all the text in my scenes red layers. If I have a background, we can make that a dark green layer, and we can actually even lock that background while we're at it. And we'll keep things, here's another text layer, we were making those red. And then our adjustment layers, I'm gonna unlock that, and we'll make that something like orange. All our shape layers now are purple, and it just gives us an idea of when we see a specific color, we kind of know, hey, that's the layer, that's the image, or hey, that's the layer, that's the shape. You can make these colors anything you want. It's just a really nice visual organization tip to help kind of not get overwhelmed with how much is in your scene. We also want to lock down specific layers. You may have noticed I've locked down at the start 2 specific layers here. I have the top noise layer, which is actually an adjustment layer, and you can't really see maybe on the screen, but that's giving us this nice noise texture within the scene. And I don't really want to move that out of the way. Without that locked, that's going to be the top layer on my layer stacks. Let's say I'm trying to select something else beyond that. If I go and drag that, even if I try to get this popsicle, it's going to move that noise layer. And again, another great reason to label, because I can kind of see, hey, that didn't move, this did. Let me hit Command Z, and we're going to go ahead and lock that down. I usually do the same thing for the background as well. just to kind of make sure that I'm not grabbing things willy-nilly as you go. You can even go and lock or unlock things as you continue to work on them within the scene. That switch is really, really important. But let's say I'm focusing on one element, and this is a rather busy composition right now. And I really want to focus on the text, the Cocoa Dream Pop and the tagline, sweet, chocolatey, and delicious. And every time I go to select those, I keep accidentally selecting the popsicle here. Well, that's easy too. We can actually solo our layers. One of the switches you have here is the solo, which will hide and reveal specific layers. So if I click the solo just on the text, you're gonna see that that's isolated those layers. And now I can easily click on them. I can apply some different types of alignment. I can even go in and, as we learned in previous lessons, I can double click and start adjusting that text to my liking. This is a really great way to kind of avoid all the visual noise. Let me go back to my move tool, hold my space bar down to kind of move the composition into place. And when I'm done with that, I don't have to turn on all the eyeballs. Watch this. I just uncheck those and everything comes back. Solo are really, really good with that. Another one that is often underused is called the shy layer. Now here's our shy guy. It kind of looks like a little person with a long nose peeking over a ledge. But the shy layer essentially hides layers for you to edit them. And this is really good if you're working in a collaborative project, because you might not want the other designers to go ahead and go through and mess with certain layers. For instance, I really like my wave layer and I like kind of some of these abstract star layers, but I don't want them to have access to those layers to manipulate them. I kind of already set the design. So what I can do is go to the shy layer and just make him peek down beneath the little ledge on each of them. And then at a certain point, I now have the ability to shy them. Once you have that done, watch this. I'm going to go to the very top switch here that says hides all layers. Basically, when their little heads are hidden, you hit that, boop, and they disappear. If you see this push down in any After Effects project, you're going to know that somebody has hidden those layers. Typically, they're hidden for a reason, but you can still go through and activate them. You can always click on that icon again if you don't want to hide that layer, or if you want to add, maybe we're adding the noise to this as well. And that's going to make your timeline a lot more manageable because there's a lot less layers you have to work with. Another layer to kind of think about is the switch that is motion blur. We can customize motion blur with every single layer. Right now, we don't have a lot of motion on this scene, but let's say we're gonna do a quick animation of the popsicle. Let me kind of scroll out with my scroll wheel, highlight the pop PNG layer, and I'm gonna hit P for position. I'm gonna make sure my cursor is at the 0 mark. I'm going to set a keyframe. Actually, let's move it. Let's make it like a 3-second animation. We're gonna animate backwards because we want our popsicle to end up here. And then I'm gonna move my cursor down and I'm gonna just move this off the screen. What this does is stuff we've already done. If I hit spacebar, 3 seconds may be a little too fast. So let's make that really quick. Let's make it under a second. There we go. Whoop. That looks okay, but it could look better, and that's where motion blur comes in. If you want to activate motion blur on any specific layer, you need to find the empty box under the motion blur column, click on that, and then that will actually turn on the motion blur in the comp. And if I hit spacebar again, there you have it. Now, the closer the speed is, you can see the motion blur is there. The further apart the layers are, the motion blur will disappear. So the closer your layers are together, that's where your motion blur will appear in your scene. Motion blur is also controlled back when we learned about compositions in these shutter angles. If I go to composition setting, advanced, I can adjust this shutter angle to have longer streaks of motion blur or tighter motion blur depending on my project. If you're doing a fast car, you may want to crank that up quite a bit. I'm going to hit cancel just because we don't really need that at the moment. But adding motion blur adds a little bit more realism to your scene, and it makes things work rather nicely in your timeline. And so you'll know motion blur is turned on because you'll see these little dots on the screen. In previous lessons, we've talked a lot about continuous rasterization. Remember, that is if you have a shape or text and it's rasterized, you're going to want to turn that sunshine button on. Here, you can see if I unlock my background layer, I can actually make that background layer vector by just turning that on, locking it back up, and it's vectorized now. That means I can scale it above 100% and it won't get pixelated. This also is going to be by default on things like shapes and text that you create inside of After Effects, and that will help immensely. We've already talked about blending modes, and we're going to talk about track mats in other layers. But another thing you may want to think about, and especially if you're taking the ACP exam, is the layer organization. So let's zoom in to this bottom element. On the exam, when you're taking the ACP certification exam, you may be asked to reveal or arrange layers in certain ways. We've already learned that you can click and drag to change layer stack order. For example here, I have a Buy Now piece of text, but it's kind of hidden under the blue button. If I drag that icon upward, you're going to see now the Buy Today is actually on top, which is what I want. But the problem that I have here now is I have these two elements, and while I can select them and I can kind of center them and make them look all nice, if I ever want to move this button as one, I accidentally may move the text. This is where something called pre-composition comes in. Don't get scared by the name. Pre-comp just means that this is a folder. This is a group, and it's really easy to do. You highlight the layers that you want to put in their own group, and you go to Composition, you go to Layer, Pre-compose, or Command-Shift-C, or Control-Shift-C. Pre-compose will take those layers and put them in their own folder. Alternatively, right-click is your best friend. Pre-compose is going to show up right there. So if you don't remember where it is up here, and you're kind of saying, I'd rather these be in their own folder, right-click, pre-compose, and then here we're going to call this CTA underscore button, and we can move all these into their new composition, and now it's in a nice little folder, but when you double click, that's going to be in that folder. So we could add animations. It's going to get its own timeline now, which is really nice. We could even maybe change the layer length in here. Maybe we want this to appear a little later, so it's not on the screen. And now, guess what? Boop, there's the button. It's going to play. What's really great about this too is now I can animate those together. If I want to animate, for instance, the scale down the line, I can do that. And what's really cool is if I put my cursor inside that composition tab and I go back to the other composition, look where it's at. So, we can do something here where we have maybe a 0%, and then, we have it pop in and we type 100 with a couple of keyframes, and now it kind of flies in. And you can adjust this. Again, these are all based on the anchor points. As we learned in previous lessons, you can go ahead and hit A for anchor point and move that. You can also use this tool up here, which is called the pan behind tool, and that can be dragged to a specific area as well. So the trick with that, as you can see, is now it's going to scale from wherever that little anchor point is, and that's just that tool right there. Just remember to go back to your move tool when you're done. So now we have a nice organized layer, and after a few seconds of animation, we have that little pop. Everything's in a nice little folder. So if I want that to kind of pop out a little sooner, check this out. It's all kind of non-destructive. I can kind of do that. I can look, I can hit that U key. We're starting to combine different methods. I can move that down here. We can put motion blur on for that layer, and there you have it. A couple of other things to recognize as we kind of finish this little lesson up is the adjustment layer element. If you do add an adjustment layer, you would go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. They work just like they do in Photoshop. In other words, an adjustment layer will add an effect or a color, or whatever you put on it for all the layers beneath it. But you'll notice the switch for adjustment layer is actually turned on. So if I were to go to my Effects and Presets panel, and maybe put a curves color correction on that adjustment layer, it's going to affect everything underneath that layer. So just something to keep in mind as you go forward, that switch will be turned on, and if I turn that off, it's just going to be a white layer. Just keep that in mind, and we can call this curves right there and get that all set up. In closing, it's really about organizing your elements. It's about thinking about not only the names of the layers and the colors of the layers, but what each layer needs to do and what each layer needs to have essential access to when you're creating your motion design. I'm going to provide this start file for my students so you can go back and you can kind of watch this video and follow along with the file. But keep this in mind as you're building future projects. You're going to have compositions within compositions within compositions, and that's okay. It's actually going to make your design life a lot easier. All right. In our next video, we're going to go ahead and dive deeper into things like shape layers and all the fun things that you can create. You can create cool effects like you see in this animation with the squiggly line in the background. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.